Thank you very much, and let me begin by thanking you all for coming here and joining us today for this inaugural discussion and inaugural dinner of the two-day think tank forum that we are hosting just around the Raisina dialogue, and many of you have traveled from faraway places to be here with us this evening and tomorrow, and of course through the week. So thank you all for coming, and this is a very, very informal setting we have today here for this inaugural discussion. This is Jim and Samir Saran. Samir and Jim, why don't you take your seats? And we will have a very informal conversation about the role of think tanks, how they've shaped up in India, and what is the discussion around the world about how they continue to be very, very important for the way we look at public policy. And this will be a short, quick roundup of some of the things that we all think about in the think tank world. And hopefully this will lead us into a more serious discussion about some of the more serious things tomorrow morning when we meet through the day on various aspects of global governance and the role of think tanks in shaping the discourse. So welcome once again, and let me give the floor to Jim and Samir.
So pleased to see the word annual in the title. When we first started this 4 or 5 years ago in terms of planning, the annual part was very uncertain. And each year the interest and the commitment of institutions in India to be a part of this effort has grown, and it's very pleasing to see that growth and development, and my hope is the institutionalization of this annual event. And with that, I want to thank Samir, Harsh, the staff of ORF who have helped in terms of their support here in India to make this annual event a reality. I also want to acknowledge that I know many of you, since this from the beginning has been an all-India effort to invite think tanks from throughout India. The first meeting, one of the clear comments was that so much of the focus is on what was described as a Delhi-centric in terms of India, and the desire to make sure that the states and institutions throughout India were represented. So I'm very pleased, as Harsh acknowledged, all of you who have traveled near and far to be here for this 4th annual Think Tank Summit. Samir and I thought that it would be beneficial, since both of us have been thinking about the future of think tanks and policy advice, and specifically in Asia and in India. And I will essentially make general comments about the trends that I think will impact all think tanks, but have, as many of you probably know, did an assessment of think tanks and policy advice in Asia, and have traveled extensively throughout the region, and have hosted annual events both here and in China. And I would point out some of the stark differences and what I see as the strategic advantages for India in terms of the development of think tanks. And I can certainly comment on the comparative dimensions of other countries and their think tanks in the discussion. And as Harsh said, we'll say some provocative things, and then hope to engage all of you in a discussion that will follow. Let me say a few comments. One is I am very bullish on think tanks and policy advice in both India and Asia, with a few major caveats that I will introduce during the discussion. It is, without a doubt, the most dynamic region in the world, with more new think tanks being created. And in certain countries, that's not necessarily a good thing. and I will reference that in terms of more specifics in the discussion. The reality, though, that I think is important and affects all think tanks, and this is global, but certainly will be fairly intense and clear in Asia, is that the political and digital disruptions that we are experiencing, some may want to attribute to Boris Johnson and Donald Trump exclusively, but the reality is that it is a global phenomenon that will shape and continue to shape our future. I tell my students, and I would tell you, that the only constant will be change, and the only and the disruptions will also be constant, and that has profound implications for all of our institutions. All of it started, some time ago, but has come into focus in the last couple years. One, the rise of the internet, the endless, and I think this is profound, and we really need to grasp it in terms of especially institutions that are involved in knowledge and information and the creation and transfer of knowledge and information. The endless advances in technology. These are fundamental and disruptive and accelerating forces that will essentially challenge each one of us and will question or raise questions for our institutions at their very core. There is, and the new reality is not only the speed of information, but we now have global information interdependence. That is, binds all of us together and creates an interconnected set of disruptions. These create what I, in terms of, and I'm a fan of Shakespeare, who, in terms of, often would suggest that the environment reflects the body politic, and what we are seeing occurring in the physical environment is mirrored in our institutions and the political environment, largely because of the acceleration caused by global climate change. This creates these forces of the rise of the internet, the endless advances in technology, global information interdependence have created, principally around the technology, but facilitated by these other forces, the increased velocity of information policy flows, which will affect our institutions, meaning that we will have to think and we'll have to understand what is happening in a way that in the political environment and developments that will move much faster than many of our institutions are structured to respond. This becomes even more dramatic and in terms of increases the speed to warp speed when we begin to talk about AI and the implications it will have most directly for our institutions. So what does this mean for think tanks? Clearly, the mission of think tanks will remain the same: to develop innovative policy ideas and programs. But what must change as a result of these dramatic changes is the products that we produce and the audiences that we identify. No longer will policymakers be the sole audience for think tanks. And that understanding that phenomenon, and most importantly, if we look at France, if we look at Hong Kong, if we look at the United States, where demonstrations are taking place, you need to understand the public. You need to help shape the debate or the implications. The risk of not doing that are quite significant. So policymakers will no longer be the sole audience, or are no longer the sole audience for think tanks. In general, think tanks must be faster as a result of the forces I mentioned. They must be smarter, they must be better, and they must be more mobile. Why? Because those we are competing against are no longer think tanks which are moving at the same speed. There are other groups, other movements, technology that is essentially facilitating and making possible as a competitor to do what think tanks do in a much smarter way, much faster way, much better, and with greater access. We must realize that, and we must get ahead of it, not be behind it. To be provocative, I will now suggest a number of things, and I apologize in advance if any of your institutions reflect this profile, but the reality, I think, both now and in the very short term, will be realized. One is journals and books are dead. Investing in those, we still have to do it, that's the challenge, but the reality is they are not read, they are not utilized, and it's not because there's not important information and knowledge there. What is the problem is that people don't have the time to read. One quick caveat, I was preparing my students for a midterm exam, and I was going through, you need to know, these chapters, you need to know these terms, and a student had the audacity to raise his hand at the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League university, and say, "Dr. McGann, why do we have to read all of this stuff? Can't you just tell us what we need to know?" Startling, but it sounded like it was a policymaker speaking to me, not a student. And since then this was 7 or 8 years ago, since then I've changed my entire way of teaching, just simply because, which is a reality, students don't have a short attention span. If it's not in color, if it's not in short bites, if they're not visuals, they don't absorb the knowledge. And if you don't engage them with the material through exercises throughout, you have lost them. Not terribly different than the work that we do. So journals and books are dead. Membership organizations are dead. Those think tanks in New York, Paris, United States generally, or in other countries, I see them withering on the vine. Why? The reason is that they are spending all of their time servicing a membership that has a not so great commitment to the institution. Some are very committed, the vast majority are not. Many look for they're like Donald Trump, transactional in their relationship. I'm going to make a contribution to support the institution if I get X in return. The reality is that worked in the past. The elite dimensions of it, the transactional dimension of it, challenges and draws the institution away from what it needs to do. And in this fast-paced environment, those institutions that have drag on their institution by servicing members and not essentially responding to the issues and focused on the work that they do and the audiences they serve, will not survive. Big, bureaucratic, and siloed think tanks are also doomed. Think tanks that are focused on producing research and policy advice, but do not have a range of products and a number of target audiences are in serious trouble. Those that are exclusively focused on the over-the-horizon are also doomed, because you may not be here if you're only focused so far out that by the time we get there, it is no longer relevant. The challenge is, and the reality is, that for think tanks, things are much more demanding, much more competitive, and we're in an information-rich environment, and we need to be able to adapt and transform our institutions to respond to that new reality. I am passionate and committed to think tanks, but I am also concerned about the future survival of think tanks based on these realities. It is for this reason that I suggest that we all think about strategic communications and marketing and not be afraid to explore that, even though it may be too business, too corporate. And also the essential dimension of strategic planning and management. Calls for a new business model for think tanks. The staffing patterns, the structure of think tanks cannot be based on the traditional academic model. The reality of what is required to survive in this environment and to thrive, and most importantly, to effectively serve our citizens and our policymakers in our country, demands that we understand these concepts, that we internalize them in our institutions, and that we transform ourselves. The reality of the fact that only constant will be change is the fact that institutions will have to be much leaner, much more nimble, and much more adaptive, both in terms of their staff and in their structure, to respond to developments which will be continuous. Technology will introduce these changes. Let me give 2 or 3 examples about what I mean. One is the power of AI, which will be the most disruptive, renders all that we do potentially irrelevant. If we don't understand that, if we don't harness the technology associated with AI in our work so that we can be provide information and not be replaced by AI or those who hold AI and the problems with it. Let me give some specific, concrete, provocative examples, and then I will end and sit down. 1, the reality today as a result of AI is that a lawyer arguing a case, a very specific case, can survey through AI, harnessing AI, every case that is exactly the same as their case and identify the most persuasive arguments in that case and the most persuasive evidence. More important and life-saving is that a doctor who has a patient with a very rare form of cancer can now harness AI to identify the clinical trials, the medication that is most efficacious for that specific type of cancer. AI makes that possible. It does not take much to imagine what it means for each one of us in our institutions. Why do you need think tanks if AI can do it cheaper, faster, and better than we can? The answer that we need to be able to internalize and to communicate is the fact that we do have a role to play. The Think Tank Forum, Why Think Tanks Matter Forum in Washington, I chose the title this year, Why Think Tanks and Policy Advice Will Still Matter in 2040. I didn't say that just to have a pie-in-the-sky discussion. I believe that it is true, but each one of us needs to understand what is our role, what value we add, and how we will still be relevant. And that will not be the case if we stand still. We have to keep moving, have to keep transforming our institutions in order to be ahead of the curve and to understand, even in an era of AI, why think tanks matter and why we make a difference.
So let me also extend a warm welcome to all of you who've joined us for this very important forum that Jim has created over the last few years, and I believe he does it now in more countries than those who have signed on to the UN. So he's pretty much everywhere. And I think it's important because in India especially, and certainly I'm going to be focused more on our region, we need to make certain decisions on the structures, the organization, and of course our products that we produce, hi Teresa, and the products we produce at these institutions. So what I want to do is I want to just list a few trends that I've seen unfold in India, and maybe it might resonate with some of you. And then I want to talk about those 7 or 8 ideas that we should be thinking about if we want to be, if we want to be adaptable to what's going to be happening in the next decade. So the first big trend that I think, and Jim has touched on it differently many times in his opening remarks, but I think is that we are moving from being institutions to becoming platforms. I think think tanks are now increasingly more platform in nature, which means we bring in lots of talent, we send out a lot of information, we curate a lot of conversations, we work with communities who are perhaps more influential than us on political and policy matters. We sometimes inform those communities so that their directions are more rational in the causes that they approach. So increasingly institutions are becoming platforms, and certainly at ORF we are looking at that big shift from becoming a bricks and mortar institute to becoming more Uber-like. And I think that's the first point I want to, first big trend, that I think think tanks need to start internalizing most of the recommendations they make to the outside world. If we tell governments to become more Uber, more nimble, more flexible, we need to do that too. If we tell governments to engage with big data, to embrace technology, to change comms, we need to do it too. And my understanding is that think tanks, certainly think tanks like ours and think tank in India in the region, we are most loath to change. We are the slowest to change. We are the first to recommend changes to everyone else, but we don't internalize those aspects in our own operations. So I think that's the first thing. Become platforms, become nimble, look ahead. Second, I think there is a tension, and it's a needless tension, between the worry that are we going to become media organizations or do we need to be research organizations? And I think that choice is no longer available with us. We have to be research organizations that have media-like features. We have to be able to communicate. We have to be able to disseminate. We have to reach more people than we've ever done, because those people have more influence than you and me in terms of policy outcomes. So that needless debate about choosing between media-like approaches to a research-like institution of the last century should be behind us. We are going to be defending expertise, and we are going to be using a media-like arrangement to defend that expertise. So I think it's no longer a tension, it's no longer an option, it's no longer a question. It is how soon we are able to do it. And I think that's a second trend that we are seeing unfold around us, and we will need to respond to it. The second, of course, is again something that Jim touched upon. It is the time sensitivity of our products. And I think we were conceptualized as the long-term, over-the-horizon research institutions, books for 3 years, journals which take a year, research papers that have a typical turnaround time of 6 months. And we were designed to do the long form and the long-term research. Now, how do you make sure that even as you engage on this, what I call narcissistic pleasure, and this is someone who's saying this, who just released 2 books in the last 1 month, and I feel embarrassed, but someone who's written, I did feel that there has to be a way that this long research can be converted into bite-sized communication, which is faster, quicker, and more responsive to what's happening around us. Case in point, my recent book, Pax Sinica, had 11 chapters. Basically, I produced 11 short-form products around it, even as I was writing the book. And I sold it a few times over in terms of the product range I produced. But I think this is something that's going to be upon us, or will be something that we will have to really examine as an option as we move ahead. And that's the second trend. The third trend, that how do we respond to time-sensitive hunger amongst constituencies, even as we engage in the defense of expertise. And I'm going to keep using the term defense of expertise, because in a post-truth world, our single biggest contribution as a think tank has to be defense of expertise, the defense of facts, the production of facts, but most importantly, the production of facts in a manner that is digestible. And that's the fourth trend. I do not think think tanks are producing facts that are resonating with those who seek it. So our facts cannot be these long quadratic equations anymore. They have to be something far more simple that resonates with many who seek those facts. And I think the post-fact world is far better at putting forward their communication than we are. So I think the defense of expertise and continuing defense of expertise is something that needs to be done. I think the other trend that we are seeing in New Delhi is that when I joined ORF 10 years ago, there were 25 folks at the institution. I think 20 were above 60. We are seeing a new generation enter the policy world. At ORF now, we have 40 under 30 and 30 under 40. So out of our 107 permanent staff in the Delhi office, 70% of our faculty is now under 40. A large number of cohort see think tank as a first career choice. Earlier, it was a post-career choice. And I think that is the other trend that we are seeing, that as long as you can at least pay them half of what consulting firms do, you can create a new cohort of those who are willing to do research, who are willing to engage in think tanks. So I think that's the other trend that we need to be mindful about. Money, I think that's important. And here I think we are in trouble. And I'll say this because what we are seeing is a concentration of funding, either a single source institution or a multi-source institution. There is a tendency for funding to be diverted to big events rather than in salaries, human resources, and in people. And I think that tension is also now quite, in fact, I was telling some big funders from outside that you're not interested in creating institutions that can do good work simply because you only want us to create these big circuses. You'll give me big money to host people in 5-star hotels and give you dinners in 5-star hotels, but you won't give me the capability to bring content that is worthwhile or that is commensurate with the location we host it in. So I think that's the tension which is quite palpable. Big money is coming in, but big money is coming towards circuses, not towards human capabilities. And India, I think, is outpacing any other country in this particular trend line. We still see in Europe and US a large amount of large foundations and large businesses invest in human capabilities and long-term research. In India, it's basically event-focused funding. What has not changed? So these are the changes that I've just, and sitting where I sit, and of course there are many others that all of you can add to these. What has not changed in the last few years? And I think that's something also which is important. What has not changed in the Indian circuit is that we have still not been able to attract local Indian businesses to invest in an institution like ours. And I know Ambassador Dev is here, and she's a beneficiary of one particular institution. I myself, I'm very lucky to work in an institution that is supported by a big business. And when a newspaper or a media house asks me that, is it a challenge that a business house funds you? I said, it's not a challenge. I wish more business houses would fund more institutions. It is a lack of interest from others that makes us look like the outlier. In fact, I think this is something that India has not been able to change, and this is something that has remained constant. We need to be creative in bringing them on board, and that's one thing that has not changed. Second, what has not changed still is the government and think tank relations. And I still think that the government is more comfortable meeting with people they are familiar with. I still feel that the culture of bringing pure experts with no previous government linkages into their offices to understand certain important issues is lacking. They will still go to the usual suspects. Most of them, are those who are familiar with their domain and in their sector and in their business. So I think the government think tank linkage is still missing. It is not robust enough. You don't see what you see in DC. You don't see what you see in London. You don't see what you now increasingly see in Brussels as well. We are still missing that particular element, and in some sense, that's what's not changed. Salary, I think that's an important part. I still think that there is a tendency for all of us in think tanks in India to underprice and underpay staff, and I think that if we are able to change that, we might be able to raise more funding, make our products more sellable, reach out to a larger community, be more recognized globally, and we can create a virtuous cycle of growth. And if we can get the investment in human capital right, I still think think tankers are underpaid in India. They need to be paid more. My colleagues are smiling at me. Okay, and the final point, I think what has not changed is our communication capabilities or the lack of communication capabilities. I think while all of us are on Twitter, while all of us have YouTube channels, while all of us have a Facebook page, what we put there is exactly what we would put on a website a few years ago. I don't think we've understood the grammar, vocabulary, and dynamic of the digital medium, and I still think we are under-investing and we are understaffed when it comes to manning this crucial task. So let me conclude by, by doing what Americans do best, 7 bumper stickers for think tanks to think about. And I truly believe in the digital age. The Americans did well in the digital age because they had the bumper sticker worldview from a long time ago. If you can't write something that fits into the bumper sticker, it's not worth engaging on. So I think that's the first idea. How do we create bite-sized content that attracts people to read the long-form research? You are not, and I don't think we have to do away with long-form research. Like I continue to say, defense of expertise has to be a primary task, but it has to be done in a far more innovative manner that brings in new constituencies to engage with that research, so that engagement strategy that can defend expertise and defend the old research methods is something we need to be thinking about. The second is enhance the bouquet of products to reach the vast number of communities who engage with different products. So I think from 3-minute videos to even memes, to GIFs, to also podcasts and video messages, long-form research, to commentaries, short edits, to expert speaks, we have to look at a range of products that enhance the communication capabilities of think tanks, that give it the media-like feature that all research institutions will need to have to remain sustainable. Third, change your stakeholder profile. We are tapping into the wrong communities. Hashtag communities change the world. Think tanks don't. Greta Thunberg had more impact on the climate debate than any think tank did in DC or anywhere else in the world. Think about it. Now, imagine if Greta Thunberg was the community you were trying to reach into. You would have been able to probably feed some of your ideas into that movement. Give your movement legs by changing the stakeholders you engage with. Fourth, diversify funding and think about crowdfunding. And this is, I think, the frontier we must explore. Can we crowdsource our funding? Can we create products that appeal to many so that many contribute? Let me tell you, this is not new either. In 2009, I asked the Heritage Foundation, financial crisis is going on. Have you laid off people? Have you fired folks? They told me, no, we have actually hired a few folks. I said, what are they doing? Why have you hired folks? He said, we've hired folks in the business development department because it's now time to raise more money. And I think if my number is right, I may be inaccurate and this is being recorded, so I'll edit later. But a few hundred thousands of them fund the Heritage Foundation, from $10 to $100 to larger amount of money. And they've been crowdsourcing for a long time. But of course, they are a political advocacy organization.
600,000 individual supporters.
600,000. There you go. So I was right. So
they were shooting for 1 million, but I think they rethought that in terms of servicing.
So 600,000 folks fund you. How independent will you be if you can get a diversified,
And the vast majority of that is unrestricted funding, which
correct, unattached funding. Yeah, they just like. So I think about diversifying your funding, crowdsourcing your funding, finding new ways of raising money. And I think we are being lazy when we still go to the traditional donors, traditional companies, traditional government sources for raising money. So think about funding. Fifth, I'm on the fifth challenge, fifth bumper sticker, go global. I think Indian think tanks cannot remain relevant unless they go global. The most important policies that will implicate India's economic growth, political stability, and technology future are being written in Berlin, Brussels, New York, Beijing. So unless you are a think tank that plays globally, engages globally, writes in a manner that has implications globally, you are eventually going to remain stagnant. So go global, and a region-first approach is important for that. I think India has an advantage being in South Asia, that what they do will be read by the region at least. So let's start focusing more on our region as we move towards becoming more global in our outputs. The sixth important point, and this slightly contradicts my complaint in my previous section of intervention, but it's true, we will have to build lighthouses. All think tanks need to build lighthouses that attract people to the other products they have on offer. Now, sometimes they could be big conferences, sometimes they could be some big YouTube shows, but you will have to create properties that attract people, and when they come to your page, you are able to sell them more. So building lighthouses is important. Having moderate successes in multiple products is not going to lead to growth. So you will have to bring these lighthouse projects to change the way you are positioned. And finally, and this is most important, and I think this is something that we struggle with in India, think tanking is not a zero-sum game. We are not in competition. Think tanks are not in competition. Innovation, education clusters, and knowledge clusters always work as clusters. That's why they are called clusters. Unless India has 100 strong think tanks that are global in content and in capabilities, my think tank and your think tank will remain average. We will grow together, create networks, be a networked think tank ecosystem, and that is something that we need to think about. So I'll leave it there, and Jim, over to you again.
So we're now going to, hopefully we were, did not depress you, but created some specifics in terms of, and Samir and I did not in any way consult with one another, but there is significant overlap in terms of our assessment. But now it would be helpful to think and have a discussion about your views on what has been presented, and most importantly, the prospects for dealing with these issues. Part of the purpose from the very inception of this meeting is to essentially learn from one another and to create, hopefully, my dream is a set of collaborative, community-wide efforts to address the problems facing think tanks in India, and to come together and to strengthen the community, because there isn't the competition. Our survival, your survival as institutions, is really dependent on how strong the entire community is. And I think on these issues, certainly I think, you know, from the very first days, you know, how do you get businesses in India to understand that it is in their interest to essentially support institutions that are thinking about critical policy issues, and that they should invest in it for that reason. Other issues, I mean, I think, you know, one of the most dramatic moments in a previous summit was a preeminent scholar of at an institution who was an economist, maybe in this room because I forget who it was, said that her parents were chest-fallen, greatly disappointed that she chose to pursue a degree in economics and work at a think tank because of the STEM phenomenon, which I think is the other part. The other issue that I would throw out in terms of India is the importance of both hard power and soft power. Hard power in terms of understanding the new world that India and the Indo-Pacific is in, and how to prepare the region and India for that. And soft power. The Chinese get that. India doesn't get it. In terms of how do you build the capacity to send legions of Indian scholars and institutions out to build bridges and to send the message and in terms of to correct misperceptions about the country. And then finally, I would say that India is an exceptional country and has exceptional and strategic assets that are undersold, and that it is the institutions in this room who can make that happen. And it is in stark contrast to China. I mean, I've studied both countries. I hold similar meetings in each country. You have significant advantage that in terms of going global, there is an opportunity because people are very interested in India, not just in the US, but across the board, and that is an opportunity that needs to be seized. So we have mics.
Thank you, David Malone, former think tank person. I thought both of you made valuable contributions. I think, Samir, you hit a huge scope of issues. The one thing I'd say, and I have it in mind because it was the case for a mid-sized think tank I'm fond of and follow, is that what worked for them is constantly scoping dogs that don't bark, an issue that is not being worked on by 100 other think tanks. Now, that may be less relevant in a city like Delhi, but I think in many cities in which there are quite a large number of capable policy research groups, the scoping of what is being done by others, and also, as a corollary, what is not being done by others, is often crowded out by, immediate imperatives. And so I think the scoping function in many places that host a number of very capable think tanks suffers considerably, and the ones who go to the extra effort of scoping are the ones that often surprise by getting the loot, because there's a head of state somewhere or a head of a company or something like that who actually care about this issue, and when they start trying to market it, they discover, well, there are 2 or 3 people out there, because it always comes down to people who are willing to place their institutional bet or their personal bet on this issue being somehow further developed. So just an additional idea, but I found it a very stimulating set of remarks. Thank you.
Yes. And then the next, it's the left.
I think the major problem is of alienation. Think tanks in India, they are almost alienated because they keep it to themselves, and unless they gather weight. How can they gather the weight? They can gather the weight by working with other institutions. And I would very strongly recommend that think tanks in India must get to teaching institutions. If they don't get to teaching institutions, they can never rise. Because you can understand, you take, I think, this country, Buddha. Now, Buddha had a message, but the message had to go through far and wide. And the message went too far and wide because of his disciples. But what happens is that we have utterly failed here in creating disciples because we think that we only can think. We must go beyond ourselves. If we don't go beyond ourselves, we just can't move.
Okay.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm Commodore Vasan. I look after the Chennai Center for China Studies, also the Regional Director of the National Maritime Foundation. First of all, thanks to both of you for kicking off this event and setting the tone for the discussions today and tomorrow. My main point was about reaching out to the youth, partly complementary to what was brought out earlier. Dr. Samir brought out about the 40-30, 30-40 equation is institution. Now, this talks about the people who are working there. But I am trying to look at the student community, which is not generally interested in think tank activities. So, for example, we have some 200 young students who are participating in C3S. The Young Minds of C3S is what we created. And that I find is giving us a lot more dividends in terms of fresh inputs being given to what we do. So I think this is more important for us to reach out to the student community and not just look at the PhD scholars or the interns or the research who are going to be working with you. I think this is a major point, in my opinion, that will contribute immensely to what we do in think tanks. Thank you.
Right here, and then why don't you just do that table sit closer, and then we'll move here.
Hello, I'm Jyoti Parikh from Irade. Both of you really summarized things so well, and that's how we have been going through the going through this experience. But I would like to say that Jim mentioned about not changing policymakers alone. And we did set up our institute to be called multi-stakeholder institution, because we find that everybody is a decision maker, whether it is communities or private sector. Private sector decides whether they want to invest or not. If let's say take electric vehicle, the consumer decides whether it wants to buy it or not. Somebody decides whether it wants to put charging station or not. So it works out that all the people are decision makers, even if so basically our role is then to act as a bridge of how these stakeholders can come together under what circumstances. So that's what we find. So I just wanted to add that this is what we find from time and again, that if we interpret our job of seeing where are the gaps, how to link with consumers to producers, producers to government policies, and so on and so forth, that works much better. Your comment on journals are dead made me think, yes, it's true. We don't, as a think tank, we can't afford to subscribe to journals. But at the same time, I'm just wondering, is it right to throw away so much knowledge done over the past centuries and decades, especially past decade? So there should be some intermediate solution to this, what you are saying. I don't know what it is, but just it's a question to thrown at the audience.
No, over here. Oh, another. A lot of voices at that table.
Good evening, sir. I'm Kanchana. I'm from the Center for Land Warfare Studies, New Delhi. So you mentioned about the STEM phenomenon. In fact, I want to say in the Indian perspective, in the Indian example, I think Indian think tanks tend to focus a lot on the social sciences perspective. So how do you make sure that an engineer goes into think tanks and all? Shouldn't we be having more partnerships with institutions offering STEM degrees, so that we have a more sciences perspective in think tanks as well? Thank you.
Very good. At long last. Yeah, bring in Mike.
My name is Ashok Khosla. I work with Development Alternatives and with the Club of Rome. I think both of you covered a terrific spectrum of real issues. But there is a squeeze. There's a squeeze on think tanks. And it's all over the world. It's not just in India, it's in Brazil, it's in the US, it's in Europe, it's in Egypt, it's in Turkey. We've got a world situation which is actually inimical to the survival and the value of what think tanks normally should be doing. Think tanks should be looking at the questions that other people don't ask, looking for answers to questions that really are going to determine the lives of people in the next century and maybe beyond. It is the think tanks of the world who created the issues of all the headlines today: climate change, biodiversity, species loss, extinction. You name the big issues. And our headlines are either about who does what to whom or about survival, big issues. And I feel that we've got to go a little deeper into the way in which these think tanks can be nurtured despite the animosity of governments who find it very inconvenient to have not just criticism, but independent thinking. And think tanks are about independent thinking. So we've really actually got to now figure out how we take responsibility as think tanks to become sufficiently plausible, credible, that no one can ignore us. And I feel Samir put his finger on many of these issues. Our commitment to academic rigor sometimes gets in the way of being relevant. And, excellence is extremely important, but relevance is even more important. And I think I've been, for 50 years working in think tanks, and all I can say is that we don't always remember that it's real people, real issues, real environmental problems, real social problems that need very rigorous, high-quality thinking and action. So one of the things that I discovered about 30 years ago when I was setting up Development Alternatives as a think tank was that it had to be an action tank too. Without being grounded in the realities of the world, it was very difficult to address these issues in a way that they were going to make a difference. So I think there's room for us to think beyond just think tank. I think it's think and do or think and act tank, which is very rare at the moment. We don't have really high quality, rigorous and academically superior thinking by people who actually have ground reality as well. And on the other hand, these very same people have to have the ability to interact with policymakers. So think tanks are in between, actually, the ground reality and the stratospheric policy-making world. So I would suggest that we rethink our own roles and our structures and our functions to be able basically to look at all of these things. I look at your lists, which come out every year, and I find not very many who are actually able to span that 3 layers, if you like. There may be more layers, but 3 is enough for us to start with. I would basically say that financing, what Samir said, being indebted to people who have their own agendas is a major threat to think tanks. One of the reasons why I set up my organization as a social enterprise was to be able to generate enough income so that we weren't really dependent. That's not an easy model, and it didn't work as well as I wanted it to work. I don't think we've been able to pay the salaries that we need to attract the kind of quality of people that are going to really make a difference. And we pay the cost of that. But basically, it seems to me that we have a much deeper set of issues that we need to deal with, which is essentially that in a market-based world, the ability of organizations to survive depends on creating value that people are willing to pay for. So I would like very much to just leave the point that think tanks do need a lot of support. I don't see it coming from governments or from corporations in the measure that's needed. And therefore, they have to now transform themselves into figuring out what part of their work will be able to generate the kind of revenues that will pay for the really outstanding work that they have been doing in the past when things were easier. Thank you.
We're going to close the discussion. I'm sorry. Signals that dinner is ready, and I got a further signal that time is up. Samir and I will just make some very brief comments, and then dinner will be served.
So I don't want to come in the way of your dinner. So let me just say that I think they're all very valuable inputs, and certainly Mr. Ashok Khosla has raised that very important existential question, that do we generate our own revenues, purpose, communities? And I think that's something that I was alluding to, that we will have to create our own revenue models at the end, and that will decide how far we can go. There was a question on, I think you raised a very important point, David, dogs that don't bark. Let me just flip that around. I think in India, the opportunity is far wider than that. It's not only the areas that are uncovered, but there are constituencies in vernacular languages that are uncovered. Now, we have 2 years ago decided to put all our content in Hindi language and Marathi language. And we've seen a 5x growth on our website. Today, I mean, more people go to ORF website than they go to Carnegie Endowment in the US. We are neck to neck with CSIS because we have this new constituency of Indians who want this information which is never served to them. We are an English language thinking community. As soon as we can take some of the thinking to different languages, we will probably even have more policy impact. If we can take the trade debates to the local shopkeepers, perhaps India might be more enthusiastic in its embrace of a far more open trading system. So that's one important point, David. Not only areas which are uncovered, but people who are never part of debates that we have. The second, of course, is disciples and stakeholders. And I think that's a very important point. And that was my intervention: change your stakeholder profile. You will have to go to schools and colleges. I think at CFR, they have started helping designing the syllabus of universities and academic institutions. We have signed an MOU with 3 where we are giving inputs for their syllabus and training programs. We have regular campus outreach. Today, ORF has 1,900 young fellows in over 100 countries who come to India for 10 days and live with us each year. So right now, as I speak, there are 48 folks from 28 countries at the other hotel who are going to be with us for 10 days. We have 1,900 of those now from over 100 countries. So I think it's important, you are right. Stakeholders and youth, I think that's a point well taken. I keep telling my team, don't tell me how many people came to my YouTube. Tell me what was the age profile. I want to see if I'm hitting the 20 to 34, because they are the ones who are going to have most legs. So I think that's extremely important. And I think different think tanks perform differently on that matrix. And finally, the ACT tank. I think action, you were very bold. Let me first admire, I have taken my young fellows to your institution and shown them some of the work you have done in some previous years. So you were very bold, but I think there are other forms of ACT beyond creating social enterprises. I think acting on your own policies, for example, and seeing them to fruition is something important for institutions. Institutions, think tanks in India and certainly around the world make a fatal error. They produce a report and end the project. I think your project begins with the publication of that report, and none of us take that report to a legislation, or none of us take that report because we are scared of the word advocacy. We are scared of the implications of being very loud on what we bring out. So I thank you very much. Jim has asked me to write a paper, so I'm going to take many of these points and temper my paper that I have to send to Jim very soon. So Jim, final words to you.
So Samir's referenced it, so I'll reference it. I have asked basically 50 think tank executives from every region of the world and from representing every country in every region to write a 12 to 1,500 word essay on the future of think tanks and policy advice. And that will come out later this year. Just a few quick comments. I thought the discussion was excellent. Our purpose was well served in terms of getting people thinking about these issues. My hope is that we go beyond thinking, that we do in this group have an ACT tank, and there are some things that we can think about jointly doing. I would underscore, which is really the new part of things and a trend, is partnerships, traditional and non-traditional partnerships. Underscoring the importance of that with the people in this room, but beyond, in terms of social media and others who can enhance what you do through partnerships where they are mutually beneficial. The other part is around youth. I am deeply concerned about where the next generation of think tank scholars and executives will come from. My interns tell me that one of the things that came out, which is a revelation to me, they were on a panel, because we have a panel on the diversity and innovation, and there's an important connection between that. An institution should pursue that. One of the interns said, no one has ever come to our campus to explain what a think tank is. Many say that their husband, their wife, their father, their mother don't know what a think tank is. And so many of the interns who work with me, once they learn about it, once they get the connection to think tanks, as Samir has referenced, I think will make a difference, and it is in all of our interests to really do that and help get the message out of why you should work at a think tank, why think tanks are important. It's important to explain that to the public, but it's equally important to help identify young, bright people who will come and work at our institution. Wonderful discussion, wonderful start. Let's eat and network. Harsh has a
Before you leave, just a reminder that we'll be meeting tomorrow at 9 o'clock here in the same room, and I think hopefully take some of these conversations forward. Some of the questions that have been raised by you, by the speakers here, would set the stage for some of the deeper conversations which we'll have time for tomorrow. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to hosting you again tomorrow. Thank you.